And we'll go over to Chelsea now. And thanks for including me in this this great panel, Chelsea. I really do appreciate it, and your work has been so inspirational. And just Chelsea probably won't say this, but she's been out on the front lines for some time now, working with Indigenous folks resisting pipeline construction, and I think her work is very situated in the field of that resistance. So Chelsea will, I don't know if this is your title anymore, Indigenous Environmental Governance Beyond the Settler State, but I know that you're really in the thick of things, Chelsea, and I really look forward to hearing what you have to share this morning. So hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Leonie, I have to quickly apologize. I've been trying to put your wonderful resource list in the chat, and our volunteer Drew is attempting to help with that too. So if you're able to, Leonie, put that in the chat, or Drew and I are still working on it. And thank you for this run-up. This is an interesting panel, as our field sites are situated across a span of the globe, and I hope to provide a really nice summative here. I also want to mention that the provocative title of our panel today, which I think is, I agree with Dr. Ronco, is so intriguing, was written by Sarah Dennison, who was our panelist. She was not able to be here today, so I just want to extend our thoughts her way and thank her for this provocation and this title, and a way to think through and deeply with land-based ethics and what I'm thinking through as settler solidarity. So I will share my screen quickly. Maybe not quickly. Okay, let's see. Here we are. Okay, see that? So yes, my title remains Indigenous Environmental Governance Beyond the Settler State. I have refused to define Indigenous environmental governance. What I'm going to do is throw at you a smattering of examples and provocations that are embedded through the fieldwork that Dr. Ronco mentioned I've been conducting. These are my perspectives as a position, from my position as a settler scholar, specifically situated in lands where treaties exist and are maintained, what is now known as the United States. And throughout this presentation are sprinkled with vignettes from my field work while participating in the Indigenous-led movement to stop Enbridge's largest tar sands pipeline ever built, which is called Line 3. This pipeline was proposed to cross Anishinaabe territories, which are the original inhabitants in what is known as Minnesota now, as well as other spaces. I'm focusing on these Anishinaabe lands where Line 3 has intersected and threatens to impact the continuous ability to perform lifeways across these lands. So this is a story, it's an arc of the last 7-8 months as the Indigenous-led climate justice movement in these territories resisted emergent oil infrastructures coming from the tar sands. So Enbridge is one of the largest oil companies in the world, and they cannot quench itself of land, others' lands. So through the vertical territorialization of subterranean space, striated pipelines are buried and gridded underneath the wetlands of Anishinaabe territories in what is now known as Minnesota. Then these pipes are ushered into distant memory after they are buried and covered with soil through corporate rhetoric. It's been incredible to watch that performance happen here. These lands are half water, half earth, and full of riparian zones. So the ubiquity of oil infrastructures fascinates me. They're everywhere, yet unnoticeable. They've become naturalized into the landscapes through the ways we perceive horizons. Pipeline resistance teaches people how to resist power applied across lands. And this is a deeply political position. So this presentation explains an arc of a story within multiple stories of the last 7 months spent amongst Indigenous leadership who amassed a massive amount of political endurance to oppose Enbridge's Line 3 tar sands pipeline from entering their territories. So Line 3, which carries tar sands bitumen from Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territories in what is known as Northern Alberta, Canada, has the ability to impact 10% of the world's freshwater if there was a spill in Lake Superior. I've begun to think on the term wastelanding as actually made manifest through waste watering projects such as Line 3. What wetlands teach you when you spend enough time with them is that water binds us. We are the carrier bags of this water. So the life cycle of this fossil industrialization fetish is not looking so good in our contemporary moment. With Line 3, Native communities are facing a termination project that I've heard described as stealth in comparison to the obtuse colonial policies of termination during the 20th century across the United States. Line 3 is a temporal boundary spanner indicating time out of mind. This is a dangerous myopia in the regulatory and legal realms. After 7 years of litigation and permitting processes, Line 3 was green-lighted for construction in November of 2020. In lieu of this, the Public Utilities Commission in Minnesota set up Enbridge to fund local police forces. Enbridge incentivized police forces across the state to survey, harass, and watch water protectors vigilantly. Through an escrow account, Enbridge reimburses police agencies and condones state-sanctioned violence, such as using pain compliance techniques on water protectors. This has been happening across the summer. There's been over 900 arrests in these territories of Indigenous and non-Indigenous water protectors resisting the emergence of Line 3. So in essence, Minnesota and the Public Utilities Commission has criminalized civil rights to show up and protest. This is essentially a Canadian transnational corporation subsidizing a state police force to protect fossil capital interests, basically an occupying force through the formality of an escrow account. Water protectors are now being charged with wildly imaginative felonies like the corporate theft of time, which begets the question, why is the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission so invested in oil infrastructure? So thinking through the corporate theft of time as an emergent felony towards water protectors really solidifies this criminalization of impeding any fossil capital flows. One of the ways Enbridge proposed to put this pipeline through wetlands, again, lands that are half water, half earth, and many in a big spectrum in between, is what is called horizontal directional drilling. So under 21 rivers across Minnesota, they applied this engineering technique which bores tunnels underneath water bodies and then pulls pipe through these artificial caverns. I've begun to think of horizontal directional drilling machines as earth eaters. For days, the ground shakes during the drilling process. According to water protectors, the experience is embodied, and partly it's the physical trauma to the earth and water. But when people feel it in their bodies, they can't unfeel it. One of these crossings goes underneath the Mississippi headwaters, home to one of the largest watersheds on the planet, on the continent. Frac outs are when drilling mud under pressure that they use to bore these tunnels under rivers gets forced back to the surface, sometimes from a puncturing an aquifer. Particularly up north in Minnesota, the La Salle Valley is an incredibly geologically sensitive area full of aquifers. Geologic assessments in this area have warned Enbridge over and over that trying to permit a pipe through these territories in this aqueous zone is geologically infeasible. So these frac outs there was a frack out, what was called a frack out bonanza over the summer across Line 3. I think 63% of their horizontal directional drilling sites produced a frack out here. And the issue with this is that the contents of the drilling mud are an industry secret. And so no one knows what is being released into the water when a frack out occurs. One main known ingredient is bentonite. This is commonly used to make kitty litter. So pipelines act as pitch points, which gets oil to foreign markets. The Indigenous-led climate justice movement has taught the world that it is crucial to block these in order to mitigate climate change and protect Indigenous lifeways, as well as critical life systems on the planet. So the story of this summer is this interesting arc that can't be ignored. It begins with these bright greens of late spring. During the beginning of the summer, the colors of the trees and grasses were so bright they seemed almost fluorescent against this backdrop of an expansive blue and cloud-sprinkled sky. The sky is really big across Anishinaabe lands. The sun has a different intensity and hue. Towering tree lines lining territories of half land and half water where the monomen grows. This is the Anishinaabe wild rice. It is the only place in the world where this wild rice grows. And through settler colonialism, the territory of monomen has shrunken from expanding around Minnesota, extending all the way out to New York State, to basically being within Minnesota and Wisconsin now. But throughout the summer, these colors shifted and dulled around the solstice when the lands were experiencing the most severe drought in 30 years. 7 weeks into this drought, Enbridge appropriated 5 billion more gallons of water, 9 times than what they originally requested, through amending a permit for about $150 granted by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Enbridge informed tribes of this water grab through an email, and that was considered consultation. So around this time, midsummer, we're in a severe drought. Enbridge is pulling water literally from fire hydrants and public drinking sources in townships in northern to appropriate 5 billion more gallons of this water. They use this for hydrostatic testing of their pipe. When you have to push tar sands through pipes, you have to heat it up and make it less viscous. And that's a very warming process. So this hydrostatic testing performs the same operation essentially and tests the validity and safety, quote, safety of these pipes. This is why they were sucking up and appropriating this massive amount of water. So at the same time, Anishinaabe lands were also cloaked in wildfire smoke from up north in Ontario. And July 29th, air quality in central Minnesota is one of the worst on the planet. All the while, the pipe is getting laid into the ground double time. So Enbridge originally proposed that the pipe would take 2 years to put in the ground. By the time it was green-lighted in November, it was done in less than half the time, 9 months at the end of August. So the construction on the front lines became more present and material by the day. One of the water protectors mentioned how Enbridge is like the FedEx for oil. So this arc of the summer through these bright greens, the dulling of the drought, being cloaked in wildfire smoke is an irony, I think, to be taken seriously. That we are continuously putting this pipe in the ground while the continent was on fire, a pipe which will accelerate warming equivalent to 50 coal-fired plants and lead to greater omnicide, the killing of everything. Line 3 is entangled with sets of multiple species concerns, and this asks us how to have fidelities towards all political agents, human and non-human. So how do we act on behalf of the land? And this to me is what Indigenous leadership in the climate justice movement and Indigenous environmental governments and land back represents. I also want to ask, what institutions put beings into the position we are looking at across Line 3 and its intersections with the Anishinaabe territories, waters, and climatic outcomes? So with land as property in US constitutional law, not based on rights-bearing beings beyond the subject-object relationships, this is dangerously myopic. Laws as the protection of property informs the regulatory world, enmeshing territories through a property lens. So the nexus of property systems in the Western legal constructs and regulatory systems do not work. This is the opposite of land back. Private property rights are asymmetrical based on wealth. The richest entities with personhood under constitutional law, including corporations, have the power to affect watersheds in the atmospheric commons. So what does following unjust laws do to us, and what choices do we make within that? To date, regulatory mechanisms are about regulating harms like pollution level allowances or kill quotas, meaning how many members of a species are allowably killed for development. So the provocation here is to look at the lacuna in laws and regulatory processes, then answer to that relationally. One expression of this is the public trust doctrine, applied when there is a regulatory gap and when no laws cover it. Another is the recentering of treaty rights and recognizing the inherent value of more than human beings. The biggest economic actors are the most motivated to protect private property rights currently. Currently, the corporate form receives more rights than people or more than human communities. The corporation is not living, but has force which compels. The equation is property rights and corporate rights into commodification. A provocation away from this, which sits squarely in Indigenous standpoints, would tilt towards community rights, treaty rights, anti-individuation, and the recognition of the rights of nature. Land-back potentials reside here. So this is political and ideological work. So typically the processes for permitting oil infrastructure projects is so fraught it raises multiple discrepancies to argue in court. Unfortunately, then the Chevron Doctrine can be applied and cede to regulatory discretion. The Chevron deference or Chevron Doctrine is an administrative law principle that compels federal courts to defer to a federal agency's interpretation of an ambiguous or unclear statute that Congress delegated to the agency to administer. So I argue that slippages occur through this and can be seen through line 3, wherein throughout 7 years of permitting process and litigation of line 3, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources did not consider a federal environmental impact statement, did not provide an assessment of climate change, neglected an assessment of potential spill in Lake Superior, or the impacts of severe drought with water appropriation. A cultural assessment for tribes was never completed under the Trump administration. Additionally, every 10 years, the Minnesota Water Quality Report is published. It has yet to mention line 3 as of currently. So this has been framed as facilitating primary conditions of regulatory capture, where corporations influence and write public policy, but it is deeper than that. As Winona LaDuke explains, regulatory capture is when the violence of the times exceeds the regulatory capacity. And these are our times. And in this case, the legal capacity is infolded into and stymied as well. This is a poor setup for multi-species equity outcomes. Infrastructure for permitting is failing species in the larger living communities. Combining this with the centralization of property rights in US constitutional law, you solidify a process which supports and codifies asymmetries of wealth and subsequent power. It's about an entire system that doesn't work for anyone: legal, judicial, regulatory, economic. This is also about the precedence of agencies. It's dangerous to give environmental regulatory agencies carte blanche, as courts won't be able to stop them. So indigenizing the regulatory process through Indigenous environmental governance acts as a deepening of ecological citizenship. It challenges legal and regulatory operations out of sync with sustaining life on the planet, not through the convenience of an ethical imperative anymore, just an immediate fundamental imperative. This is what has been shown across the line 3 resistance led by Indigenous leadership. One example of this is in 2018, the White Earth Treaty Authority of 1855 passed a tribal law which protects the fundamental rights of Menomin, their wild rice. During the drought this summer, when Enbridge appropriated those 5 billion more gallons of water, the White Earth Nation filed a lawsuit articulating what a healthy ecosystem means for the Minoman, the wild rice, and it's quite beautiful. When rights are expanded in this way, it shifts power towards the rightless, in this case, the Minoman, who didn't have a voice in the appropriation of its water sources. The opening states that Minoman wild rice, the food that grows on water, is the most important cultural and sacred food of the Chippewa, Ojibwe, and Anishinaabe peoples. Minoman has been a part of our traditional stories, teachings, lifeways, and spirituality since the earliest times to the present day. For the Chippewa, Minoman is alive, like all living creatures, and they are our relations. We Chippewa have a sacred covenant with the Minoman and the water, Nibi in Anishinaabe, and all living creatures, without which we cannot survive. Winona LaDuke calls this a 10,000-year-old sustainable economy. I propose that this is one shade of what indigenous environmental governments looks like beyond the settler state. It's when the wild rice can sue the Department of Natural Resources for appropriating its water source. And this type of governance beyond the settler state requires indigenous governance of lands and territories primarily. So indigenous-led movements skillfully put all registers of the narrative together, and I propose we should see this as valued epistemologically within the discourse. The arc of our story is sort of another beginning. This movement over the last 7 years didn't stop Line 3, but the indigenous-led movement situated in the climate justice movement against Line 3 did curtail production by stymieing the tar sands industry expansion, which nosedived in 2015. This resistance, so Line 3 was proposed to come online in 2017. It didn't until 2021. This kept the tar sands profit down. It kept the expansion down. And the Line 3 movement raised awareness of the tar sands campaign overall. So the legacy of the Line 3 fight is a millstone around the industry's neck. And it also Line 3 galvanizes national attention to water protection and indigenous rights. And then we can apply this to emergent pipelines like Line 5, which is the sister pipe to Line 3. This is the story we need to tell about Line 3. This is critical narrative framing. Critical that we tell these stories in full with the tensions and nuances present. The indigenous leadership controlling this narrative is strategic thought that is always anticipatory and much to be learned from. So some closing thoughts. Priorities for the 21st century and land back conceptually. What this panel's title has and this experience on Line 3 has got in me thinking a little bit more deeply about land back. And some of these thoughts revolve around who has access to whiteness, capital, and power, have access to land. So understanding these machinations and how they operate through bodies, I suspect contains liberatory outcomes. Recentering indigenous voices places them first, and this is where the possibilities of the future meet. Indigeneity positioned as a political axiom and political identity here. Land justice is much more than one-off transactions with tribes. Returning is not just about land, it's about tracing those complex relationships between power, capital, and money and responsibilities, and then defining pathways towards diplomatic and negotiated existence that is in the absence of empire. Lofty goals, achievable. A different reality that brings our expansive creativity with the least amount of coercion together to put our best selves forward and build a different future together. You glimpse this at water protector camps. They are radically intersectional and indigenous, female, or two-spirit-led spaces. You feel safe here. So treaties and tribal governance offer maintained equitability as principles which govern foundational shared agreements amongst distinct and differentiated peoples. Communities able to maintain differences without coercions, assimilation, or otherwise, nation to nation. So centering treaties can work towards restoring equitability for humans across groups and more than human communities as well. This could mean to look back to plan ahead, perhaps getting back to the intention of treaties when they were negotiated, and understanding how tribes articulate these intentions now. In Anishinaabe territories, there's been a lot of talk this past summer about how we are all treaty people. This treaty citizenship truncates settler-marshaled amnesia and the erasures of ahistoricity by recognizing how settler ancestors went into agreements with the original inhabitants here to steward the lands and be in good relations across these nations. These agreements that my ancestors made are still held today. So treaty citizenship is being in good allyship and good partnership with caring for these lands, bringing awareness to water, plants, and animals that sustain us all is one large part of being a treaty person. And supporting treaty rights is the pathway to get there. So what does unequivocally supporting and centering Indigenous legal systems and jurisprudence do? Climate change and land dispossession as a double violence scenario, a harm and harm, functions through the severing of human and non-human relations on all registers. Colonial capital and corporate forms are contingent on the severing of relationships across groups, bodies, beings, and lands. And as a tightening, land back is a return to these relations. So land back asks us how we will act on behalf of the land. Being embedded in relations is not a zero-sum game with land, but a positive sum game with webs of existence. Recognition of shared vulnerabilities and interdependencies can move praxis from loving lands to doing and caring for these relations as acts of responsibilities and rights. So land back asks us to watch for changes in how we think about relationality, kin, and relationships across time and space, and then act upon these shifts to form a new playbook of socio-ecological relations for the 21st century. Thank you.